Hello everyone, welcome to iNACOL's Leadership Webinar. Thank you all so very much for attending today. My clock here says 2 p.m. Eastern, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Natalie Abel. I'm a program manager here at iNACOL, and I'll be helping to facilitate and moderate today's webinar. And today we'll be exploring the Assessment for Learning project and ways that we can rethink assessments to enable deeper learning. I promise not to take up too much of your time here, but I do have a couple housekeeping items to go over before we get started. In the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a chat box, and most of you have done so already, but if you haven't, please introduce yourself. Say who you are, where you're from, what you're hoping to learn today, and share any initial burning questions you might have for our presenters. And also use the chat box throughout the webinar to ask questions, and we'll be sure to get those answered either as we go or at the very end during Q&A. We also encourage you to share what you're learning on Twitter and extend the conversation there using hashtag #RethinkAssessment, and we can add that in the chat box here in a minute for you. And today's webinar will be recorded and archived on the inacol.org website, so you'll be able to revisit today's conversation and download the slides as well. So we'll send you all a follow-up email with the link to that information. So with that, we are grateful to have presenters Sarah Collins-Lynch and Linda Pittenger from the Center for Innovation in Education here with us today. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Linda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I want to tell you just a bit by way of introduction about the center. The center was launched in 2013. We're located in Kentucky, but we work around the country, and we know many of you and have enjoyed a long relationship with iNACOL and with Susan Patrick since the time that Gene Wilhoit and I were both at the Council of Chief State School Officers, and we're launching the Innovation Lab Network. It's a real privilege and a huge opportunity for Sarah Lynch, who's going to tell you a little bit more about herself and her very interesting title shortly, for us to talk to you today. We hope really and truly that this is the beginning of many more interactions, because this work is about collaboration and it's about collective impact. We're going to touch briefly on the why behind the Assessment for Learning project today, share a brief overview, talk to you about our goals and the vision that we share with our partners, a bit about the design of the initiative, which in itself we think is testing some important assumptions about grant making and about how organizations learn, particularly learn with one another. And then we're going to spend most of the time talking about the learning agenda specifically and the learning community. So before I hand this off to Sarah, I want to give you a bit of background on the history and the context. All of our work at the center is driven, like many of you, by this huge task of helping the country shift a very complex education enterprise from an orientation on schooling to an orientation on learning and a focus on students rather than a focus on adults. We're all looking for a system capable of delivering on the promise of an education that's truly empowering to every young person. And we talk so much about this growing consensus that preparing young people to succeed and thrive in life beyond formal education requires nurturing not only content knowledge, but these incredibly important transferable skills and dispositions. Our sense is it's the integration of these that's key. That integration is the thing that allows students to take responsibility for their own lives and operate within a greater social context. Having a really strong sense of identity, agency, and competence. So the question is, how do we understand that integration so that we can act on it and truly help students, and how did that involve shifting our notion of what assessments mean, what assessment means in our system, so that assessment becomes in service to learning, to this new goal. It's true, and I think we feel like we should always say that over recent years, states and districts have improved summative assessments, and We're all much more capable of holding institutions accountable for learning, but on a narrow set of measures. Also, our reliance on summative assessments has taken them beyond their intended purpose, and we're over-relying on them for individual judgments about students and teachers. So it's critical, and this was the impetus for this project, that we turn our attention to formative assessments in a truly comprehensive and balanced system of assessment, so that we're able to create the multiple forms of evidence that we and students need to have to understand and support high levels of learning and high quality teaching. So these are the problems that we're trying to address. Traditional summative assessments measure only a small percentage of what really matters. Assessment has been too isolated from instruction, and it's become almost totally conflated with accountability, and educators have not been prepared and empowered, given agency to determine the most appropriate roles for assessments that support learning. And finally, we would love to take ownership for this, but it just was a serendipitous sign of the way times are changing. We issued our request for learning, which you'll learn more about in just a moment. And applications were due the same day that ESSA was signed into law. That's opened up another tremendous platform of opportunity for this type of work. So let's all think about that together, and I'm going to hand things off to Sarah now.
Thank you so much, Linda, for that introduction and for sort of setting our context. Our goal here today is really, this is a nascent initiative. We just launched formally in the spring, and our grantees are really kind of at work starting their projects this summer. And so we want to share a little bit about what the project is, the sort of theory of action and underpinnings and architecture behind it, and also share what we've learned so far. And then really open it up and have a conversation to help you all, the folks on the ground, locate yourselves in the project. Because we consider this to be more than just a grant-making initiative. It's never just been about issuing a request for proposals or a request for learning and then cutting some checks and patting ourselves on the back for giving money to people doing good work. We're really fundamentally engaged in thinking about this as field building. Like, how do we shift this conversation to fundamentally rethink the roles that assessment should play to advance student learning coming out of this era of accountability and assessment. The work is led by the Center for Innovation in Education, but we also partner with really great people and smart partners like the Next Generation Learning Challenges. And our kind of part of our theory of action behind this is that in order for us to rethink assessment, we also need to rethink the way that grant making is done. And so what we're going to try to do, not too much navel gazing about what a clever initiative we've designed and launched, but it helps you understand what it is we're trying to accomplish and the sort of movement we're trying to catalyze. And fundamental to this is this notion that we're looking to lead with learning. All the way from the top to the bottom, we're posing questions to the field and to ourselves and posing hypotheses of how we can fundamentally rethink the role of assessment for teaching and learning and rethink the role of assessment for systems improvement. And that's kind of where my job title comes from. That I'm technically the Assessment for Learning Project Director, but I've been dubbed the Chief Curiosity Officer. So my job is to keep posing questions and gathering and synthesizing insights, not just from our grantees, but also from experts in the field, and also from folks like you all, from practitioners that are engaged in this conversation and doing this work as well. So what are the goals? And so Linda touched on this in sort of setting the context. But through the Assessment for Learning, we're looking to advance our understanding of assessment's essential role in the learning process as learning models become more personalized, less cohort restricted, more competency-based, and student-centered. I could ask all of those, all of you all out there who are part of the Unequal Network to use your little raise your hands and raise the roof, because I hope that you see yourselves in your work at least doing that second part in Goal 1. You all are all working towards learning models that are more personalized, less cohort restricted, more competency-based, and more student-centered. So if we think about the Latin root of the word assess, means to sit beside, right? Like, what a powerful kind of vision that is, and how different that looks from how the word assessment has been used in this context of this era of big standardized tests for the purposes of accountability. So when you all are working with your students out there and thinking about more personalized, more competency-based models, you know that evidence of student learning, the role of you all to sit beside students in their learning process, this is the work we're trying to catalyze. And we're trying to catalyze it in new models of learning, not old, outdated models that are focused squarely on content knowledge and compliance. So thinking about those assessment practices to sit beside our kids in new models of learning, we also have a secondary goal is to help inform these crucial enablers. Things like a new vision for assessment and accountability systems, thinking about how we build educator capacity to do this work, and then also thinking questions around use of technology tools. And again, like raise your hands, raise the roof, these are things that are like ringing true to you all because you're on the front lines redesigning and rethinking how systems can look to support new models of learning. So our question is, where does assessment fit in all of our work, right? To sit beside, and what can assessment do to foster and push that forward? So we're looking and we are funding and building out and posing big questions to support approaches to assessment that are locally effective. So right now we have 12 grantees that are local sort of proof points of doing interesting and effective and innovative work. But we're trying to nationally network them. So we really are truly building a learning community to learn from one another, pose questions, keep refining one another, keeping ourselves on the edge of our learning rather than kind of complacently doing stuff we've already been doing in the past. And then our vision, too, is to support that work in a dialogue where these don't become 12 boutique solutions that we hold up and kind of admire, that these projects are turning towards what we're calling systemness, thinking not just about how we scale and replicate those practices, but how these assessment practices are integrated into balanced systems of assessment and balanced learning systems. So this is something where I would kind of pose and have you all think about like what the word systemness means to you, like in thinking about like how your work integrates as a system as a whole, and if that's kind of a provocative question for you in your work today. Another vision is really to rebrand assessment from a negative association with testing. So kind of a little side note, when we issued our press release announcing our 12 grantees for the Assessment for Learning project, I was, really excited to see what media pickups would happen, who in the world is interested and wants to share and tell the story about these kind of cool projects that we're launching around the country. And every single one of the headlines from the press pickups from our press release used the word test in the headline, right? So new grant initiative looks to retool tests. And it sort of struck me right in the heart of kind of sunk me of like, oh, they don't get it. Like assessment as a practice has become so synonymous with large-scale standardized tests that our real goal is to rebrand assessment. It's not something as a four-letter word that's a little kind of with negative associations like the big test, but something that's powerful and provokes and provides both student agency and teacher agency, the real humans in the system. Lastly, we also want to illustrate ways that grant making can create a movement of innovative learners. So again, and that's why we have you gathered here today, and we'll support that with some conversation towards the end. So as I stated, we've designed this kind of entire project to be around, to kind of lead with the learning. So we're posing some key hypotheses for how we operate as a grant initiative. And so that's kind of how I'm going to speak to you about what we're doing today. This first hypothesis is around a funding partnership that we've assembled a really interesting and eclectic group of experts that bring different expertise to the table. And the hypothesis being that together we're going to yield new approaches to our work, that we're all refining and all sort of moving out of our comfort zone and doing things differently. So again, this is funded in part by the Gates Foundation and the Hewlett Foundation. The Gates Foundation really focusing on personalized learning. Hewlett's focused on deeper learning. So where those interact and the kind of incredible synergy that happens when you look at deeper learning in the context of personalized learning, that's really where this funding kind of initiative came out of. We're led by the Center for Innovation in Education, and CIEs was founded by Gene Wilhoit, who's been a leader and a mover and a shaker and a really kind of thought leader in the policy realm for his entire career. And so CIE really sitting in a space of policy innovation, but that's rooted in and raising up great innovative practice. Our partners are also Next Generation Learning Challenges, and their expertise being really in kind of using grant making to catalyze a movement. And so really kind of connecting with them and their grant making expertise. Two Revolutions is a design partner that you all may be familiar with that really has kind of pushed our thinking in terms of how do you build a learning network. And then we also work with a whole host of, we'll call technical assistance providers. Of experts who can help inform and fill out the work that we're trying to accomplish. And I hope maybe some of them are even on this call today. So what is it? When we think about fundamentally rethinking the role of assessment for learning, what does that really mean? It's a big, broad enterprise. And so what we've tried to do is organize it into a learning agenda, a set of questions, and this is my role as Chief Curiosity Officer, is to hold this up and ask our grantees to help inform and also hold this up to the field to help us kind of fill in what are the gaps and where are the areas that we really want to galvanize around assessment. So I'm going to read them to you, and as I read them to you, this is the charge today. We're going to share some grantees that are doing this work, but I also want you all to kind of raise up and participate and tell us how you can locate yourself in this learning agenda. What are you all doing out in the field? So the first question is, how can assessment support a broader definition of student success? We've heard this a lot. We know that Linda raised it up earlier, this notion of non-cognitive skills, metacognitive, social emotional learning. This sense that we are moving away from a narrow set of content knowledge-driven learning goals as the purpose of education. There's a broader set of skills and dispositions that we all know our students need in order to succeed after high school. So the question then is, how can assessment support that broader definition? And there's a lot of energy and focus in this area, but it's our sense that that work is incomplete, and we have some really interesting and provocative grantees that are trying to pose up some hypotheses and some examples of how we can do so, how we can support a broader definition of student success. Secondly, what assessment practices most effectively empower students to own and advance their own learning? So this is really about a question of student agency. And if you think about an old model of assessment, for too long, assessment is something that's done to kids, right? Really good at measuring kids and where they are in certain knowledge. But what does it do to have students offer up evidence of learning and then give them the power and agency to own and advance it forward? And our proposition is that assessment practices where they're at right now don't typically build student agency, but it's the powerful tool that can really be an ingredient for students owning and advancing their own learning. So we have some examples, and we're really interested in this concept of the interaction of assessment and agency. Not necessarily how do we measure agency, right, as a non-cognitive skill, but how do we support and foster it? Like, how can it be a tool to support agency? It's an interesting sort of interplay there. Next question is, how can we most effectively build educator capacity to gather, interpret, and use evidence of student learning? You all know this, but it's not just like having good instrumentation. It's about how do we empower educators to develop or use that information and have it really have assessment drive instruction and support learning at the classroom level. Whether that classroom is digital or brick and mortar. This notion of how do we get educators to build agency of their own through assessment practices? Because similarly, old models of assessment tend to control for variance in teachers, and also they kind of take away their agency in the process. Fourth, how does assessment for learning inform broader context of policy, accountability, policy, and system design? So how do we do things differently? The end of NCLB has opened a door for us to think and act differently in how we design our systems from an accountability and responsibility perspective. But in those, assessment's going to potentially have a new role. So let's pose some hypotheses rather than doing business as usual. And lastly, and this is the most important one, how do we pursue equity through assessment for learning? So in old models of assessment, an equity framework was really just about using large-scale instruments to measure and analyze achievement gaps, and then maybe analyze items for bias. Like that's the sort of role, that's the equity lens that we would use. But when we're talking about assessment for learning in a classroom context, when assessment is sitting beside a learner, equity plays a different role and has a much more important kind of charge here. That's a human side of equity, that relationship between the learner and his learning community, the learner and the educators involved, and the learner and his kind of relationship with his own educational path. And so how do we pursue equity through assessment for learning? This notion of equity not just in terms of achievement gaps, but in terms of delivering on the promise for every student to succeed, and how assessment can support that in a new way. So this is intentionally obscure. When we were creating our portfolio of grantees, we used our learning agenda and really started drawing constellations of kind of how can our grantees inform these questions? And we don't necessarily have them in clusters where one grantee is solely focused on student agency or another grantee is solely focused on system design. Each of our grantees have a really unique and interesting sort of connection to one another and connection to those learning agenda questions. And so at the bottom of the page, you'll see a shortened URL where you can link and go to the live version of this constellation map of our learning agenda. It's constantly growing and evolving, where you can kind of hover over one of the dots and see how the black dots being your grantees, how they connect to individual learning agenda questions, and hover over the color dots and see how those learning agenda questions are informed by different grantees. And it's a pretty neat tool, and I'd ask you all to kind of explore and parse it out further. And again, if you think about locating yourselves in this learning agenda, the question then is, how would you locate yourself in like our constellations of, in our kind of the ALP constellation? And here are our stars, our bright stars in that work. And some of them here are actually today. And I'm gonna, you may want to contribute, or if I call on you to kind of explain further what if I'm bumbling through what your project is. But we have an interesting sort of array. We didn't want to just focus on one level of the system. So we have individual schools. In fact, we have even an individual science department from one school in San Diego, all the way up to schools, districts, state departments of education, and then also networks, like lateral learning networks that are composed of different districts collaborating together, or schools spread across the country that are connected through organizing partner that's a nonprofit organization. So you can see the diversity of our grantees here in the list, but here's the diversity of the work that's coming out of this. So if I led with this, if I led off today with kind of our list of our grantees, it wouldn't make much sense. And so that's why I led with the learning agenda. So you can see how these grantees and their projects pose interesting and provocative sort of hypotheses and insights to the questions that we're looking to wrestle with. So for example, the Center for Collaborative Education is partnering with districts in Rhode Island to develop micro-credentials for teachers to learn how to design, implement, score performance assessments in their classroom, and then also to take on this role of assessment leadership in a school. So that's an interesting sort of how do we build educator capacity, and then also to support kind of a broader definition of student success. We have New Hampshire or Colorado that's building kind of two interesting paths related to work they're doing to transform their system in terms of learning progressions that moves away from grade bands and common tasks that's looking at how do we integrate a system of assessments that includes a broader collection of student evidence. And so this is really kind of a system and learning network that's residing within a state. We have the science department at Delago Academy of Applied Sciences down in San Diego, and they're partnering with local industry to create next generation science badges. And so I don't really need to explain badges to you, but oftentimes I explain this to other folks, like, you know the Boy Scouts and how they would earn merit badges, and they're sort of self-directed. You create the opportunities and the assessment definition, but let the kids lead and choose what badges they earn. So if you think about what a powerful sort of approach that is to student agency, where they collect and curate their own collection of science competencies, and those science competencies are validated by local industry to where they could eventually work. It's an exciting, innovative approach to assessment at the school level. We have a network of districts in Virginia that are working on student-led assessment for the graduate profile. So there's kind of, you all are all probably living in spaces where there's an esoteric definition of college and career readiness, or a new set of competencies adopted at a higher level where we're defining, again, a broader definition of student success. And the question becomes, all right, then how do we collect evidence against that definition? How do we collect evidence of that graduate profile that's college and career ready? And this group of districts in Virginia are using a practice of student-led assessment to fulfill that need. And an interesting sort of secondary component of it is like a system-wide collaboration, laterally, districts collaborating and learning from one another. In Hawaii, we are working with the State Department of Education, who've adopted a new outcomes assessment framework. The HA outcomes, which is culturally rooted definition of what students need to be successful after they graduate from high school, but culturally rooted in Hawaiian values and the Hawaiian experience. And it's HA, or breath, belonging, responsibility, excellence, aloha, total well-being in Hawaii. And it's a powerful story, and I'm going to share a little bit more about it in a few minutes. But they're not just how they generated the outcomes framework itself, but how they're approaching the assessment practice is something that I believe is kind of an interesting sort of turn on you and turning assessment practice on its head. We have Henry County Schools that's working, the name of their project is Making Feedback Meaningful. So it's this really kind of compelling part of the assessment practice is not just to gather evidence of learning, but to give feedback to the learners so they can act on it, right? And Henry County is developing and focusing specifically on that part of practice. And Henry County is a district that's going through wholesale transformation, looking at personalized learning. And so this is kind of an important component that they've identified in order to better personalize learning, that the feedback component of their assessment practices. is something that they focus on. We have network performance assessment coming out of California, the state of California, this notion of there's an opportunity in a new accountability design to learn from one another and raise up performance assessment as a potential multiple measure. But you don't just advocate for performance assessment, that there's a real need for a professional learning community and support there. In New Hampshire, there's an initiative to go to no grades and no grades, and this is something that would probably excite many of you here, this motion of moving from no grades, meaning no grade band levels. Students are moving along learning progressions and learning pathways, and no grades A, B, C, D, E, F. It's based completely on competency. When students demonstrate competency, they moved on. So our investment here is the role and the important part of assessment in creating kind of the architecture of that system redesign. Summit Schools is looking at practical measures for habits of success. So there's a lot of, in this world of measuring non-cognitive skills, there have been lots of folks who've raised up surveys, and we can probably name a few that have some prominence. Surveys that students self-report on their status of these skills, and these items and the tools have been validated in interesting ways. But there's a lot of concern and problems potentially in trusting the validity and the usefulness of a large-scale assessment student self-report survey. So what Summit Schools is doing is kind of recognizing that students themselves are the right source to kind of sit and reflect and think about the habits of success, but they're using kind of the practice of practical measurement as the entry point for those survey questions. So rather than asking students, for example, global questions about how they feel about their perseverance through difficult tasks, students are given opportunities in real time to reflect on the current tasks that they are grappling with in that real moment. And then, which is a really interesting and kind of turn on its head, but then the question then becomes, how do you integrate and collect and synthesize those measures to be something meaningful to guide instruction? Two Rivers Charter School is a really interesting charter school that's been doing expeditionary learning for many, many years. And their project, however, is they want to ask this question of, they want to know whether or not the skills that students are developing in these learning expeditions are transferable. And so they're developing performance tasks that focus on specific skills like creativity and critical thinking that they would be developing in these learning expeditions, and then see and develop separate performance tasks that test the same skill in a different context. If you think about the core definition of deeper learning being the transferability of these skills, it's a really exciting and cutting-edge piece of work in a school that's already really designed to be focused on deeper learning. And lastly, we have West Ed working with a group of schools in Arizona and Oregon that's using video feedback to build teacher and student agency. So if you think again about making feedback meaningful, they're developing a protocol and tools for teachers to be assessed and supported by one another as professional learning community, and really kind of focusing squarely on this notion of new ways of building educator capacity in ways that focuses squarely on that we build teacher agency, and through the experience of having your teacher agency built and teachers understand more fully how to support student agency in the classroom. Whew, that was a big one. And it's 11:33, and so I was going to focus and go more deeply on some of our grantees, but I really want to kind of give a moment to, I'm going to kind of maybe put some folks on the spot. But one of the kind of core design principles, so Gary and Melissa, get ready. One of our core design principles of this grant initiative is that by we ask our grantees to submit a request for learning. So don't just tell us what you're going to do. Tell us what you are looking to explore and better understand, and what's your plan to gather evidence to gather evidence and act upon that information. And so really it's modeling a sort of formative assessment process in the very DNA of our grant making. And the theory of action behind that being, if we want our grantees to be able to course correct, right? Well, a lot of this is innovative practice, and so if things need to shift a bit, for our grantees to feel empowered to do so, and that also kind of set this learning orientation so insights are constantly being generated, right? It's not just something you sort of formally reflect on at the end. And so some of these are examples that I was going to walk through would be like, what are the examples of the hypotheses that our grantees are testing, or some essential questions that they're posing to the work, so their own local learning agendas. And one of the things that I really love is hearing from the grantees as the Chief Curiosity Officer, hearing from the grantees their insights, their aha moments, and their course corrections. And so I'm going to give Gary maybe 5 minutes if you want to speak to it, if you feel comfortable. But one of the things I love about the Center of the CPE project is this sort of full disclosure that in the process of creating micro-credentials, there was a realization that supporting and fostering teacher agency means letting go a little bit of the control over the context and the outcome, right? It's a different dynamic and a different relationship, and it was just like an interesting aha moment for me. And I don't know, Gary, are you capable of talking? Do I have to pass the microphone to someone?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I am. So yeah, that was a great aha moment. It was also slightly terrifying. We realized that we've been telling teachers to give students more agency and more agency and more agency, and now we're designing a system that gave more agency to our learners, and we realized that that made us feel uncomfortable. So it was a very sort of meta moment where we felt the consequences of what we were telling teachers to do. It was really interesting. So so there are a couple things about this project that are especially interesting to me. One is that we don't know how it's going to turn out. That may sound obvious, but for us, a viable answer to this hypothesis would be, no, it didn't work. That is, like, we don't want that to be what happens, but that's a possibility, because we feel like the work of performance assessment and leadership development is so adaptive, and micro-credentials generally are used for more technical pieces that we don't actually know that the two connect. So we're working to see if that can happen, and so that's really interesting. So as we develop these, we're constantly coming up against a line that says, well, what's the grain size of a micro-credential? Here's some advice for everybody. If you're ever in a conversation about micro-credentials and you want to sound intelligent, just ask, well, but what's the grain size? It'll be great. So we've developed the micro-credentials, and we're sort of trying to figure out how much do you help people along. I mean, the ideal micro-credential is you put the credential out there, people discover it, they do it on their own, and they submit it. But do we really not want to provide support? So we put resources in the micro-credential. We refer to resources. But we also have online courses that we're developing that are separate from the micro-credential. So do we require those, or do we just offer those as a resource? Because if we require them, then that's seat time. To require somebody to go through a chunk of instruction before you allow them to demonstrate proficiency that's the definition of seat time. So we've come upon all of these interesting philosophical questions that just the structure of micro-credentials brings up, because they're sort of an enactment of what we've been saying is a philosophy of learner-led and student engagement, but acting it out has been a challenge. So the design period for these micro-credentials has been really exciting. And so if that's what I'll say now, unless you have questions, Sarah, or anybody.
I think what excites me, Gary, is, I mean, I love CCE because you're such transparent learners. And you all can hear that just in kind of Gary's posture and kind of talking about his project. But we call it, in this question in our learning engine, this question of how do we build educator capacity around assessment. We talk a little bit about this notion of walking the talk. That too often in any professional learning and education, we talk about kind of new models of learning for kids, and then the professional learning we give to our adults to sit and get, right? And so what I love about the micro-credentials is that it's truly sort of modeling the competency-based performance tasks of the kind of work you're trying to transform in the system. But the challenges you're bumping up against are also sort of fractal versions of what happens when you shift practice, and the sort of tension, degree of tension that happens, and the risk-taking, and sort of the sincere learning orientation that you have to bring to that process. So thank you, Gary. I really appreciate it. And so, Melissa, I've given you a little bit of time to think, and if you can, I'm going to share a little bit about Henry County Schools and what I love and what I've heard again from you all. We just had Henry County's first presentation of learning, and I'll share a little bit more about that in a minute. But Henry County, as I shared, is an entire county in Georgia that's focused on transforming around new models for personalized learning. And they wanted to focus on this notion of making feedback meaningful as an essential part of the assessment process, and that feedback is what can drive and have students take ownership over their learning when they get assessment results back, that those assessment results are actionable. But the approach you guys took was really interesting, and the kind of learning plan seemed to be pretty technical. We're going to create these protocols, and we're going to integrate, the learning is really going to be how do we integrate these feedback opportunities into our larger learner dashboard, sort of a technological problem. And that when you all started digging in and doing some early conversations, that the role and the challenge of feedback is not a technical execution, it's a question of relationships, right? And if you, like, how powerful is that? Again, it goes back to this notion of the root word of assessment needs to sit beside. It's a human practice. It's not a technical practice. And so, Melissa, I'll let you, if you can get unmuted, you can share a little bit too, really briefly, so we can make sure we have time for a Q&A too.
Sarah, this is Jay. I believe Melissa had to leave some of the things. Hey. But yes, as you've been speaking to, what we are challenged with is that for feedback to really be meaningful, we're talking about a true conversation, not just more words coming from teachers to students. And for that conversation to exist, we need to have healthy relationships where there's trust already built, so that we have engagement, so that we can risk fear and risk failure. And that part of our big challenge is to come back in and say, are the adults in the building already practicing these things? Are there any models of them actually being learners like this? What's the relationship between teachers with one another, teachers and their principals? And how much have we just assumed that the one-way conversation of critique has been effective feedback? So we have tried to take a step back and begin to lay those foundations again of what it is to begin establishing relationships with students, creating that kind of trust, so that not just in classroom discussion, but in goal setting, in daily practices, as well as in larger scale alternative assessments, that there is a continuous conversation that allows not only the teacher to speak, but the student to be able to, in a respectful and healthy way, be able to say, well, I don't know what you mean, or that piece of feedback isn't very helpful, and so that the student is truly developing agency and ownership, not just hearing more as opposed to having it written, or having just more timely feedback, which is really important, but for it to be this sense of us learning together, of something we're doing with one another instead of to one another.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay. I appreciate it. Thank you for kind of letting me put you on the spot. So I'm going to skip through and kind of talk a little bit about, so Jay and his team from Henry County just had our first sort of presentation of learning. But one of our kind of structures that we've identified as important to this is that our grantees shouldn't go it alone. That we want to be providing flexible, informative support so we can get them connections to get them feedback from their peers in the learning community, that they can identify areas of need and request support from technical assistance and expertise, technical assistance providers and experts around the country. So as Jay just kind of noted, one of their their course correction included in shifting their focus from sort of a technical approach to integrating meaningful feedback into their system is focus on relationships and goal setting, but we're going to connect Jay and his team with some expertise related to those areas. And lastly, kind of collaborative learning groups, where we have regular meetings and kind of bring expertise, where experts into the conversation to sort of unpack shared problems of practice. And lastly, so the last part of this conversation is really the last hypotheses, is that like in just creating a grant initiative, like we want to have our grantees be able to integrate the practices that they're building and refining, integrate them into their local systems and their state systems, but then also as an initiative to integrate into this kind of larger educational conversation in the field. And I have this as a blank slide because we're still grappling with this, of how do we really start engaging the broader field. Questions related to investments for helping we support our grantees to integrate and scale these practices. How do we gather and share insights from the grantees to inform the broader field? So as you all are listening, and if you hear about projects that you're really curious about and you would love to learn more about how their work is going, or you see questions in the learning agenda that really ring true to you and you want to hear and learn about more about how assessment practices are supporting student agency, for example, or new approaches to building educator capacity, a question that we have is, how do we gather and share those insights to inform the broader field? And then how do we engage and provide learning opportunities and learn from others who are committed to rethinking assessment? Because we humbly understand that there are far more people out in the field who are doing and thinking and acting in these ways, that are on the front line, they're on the edge of their own learning about the role of assessment in new models of learning and new models of schooling. So how do we engage and learn from those, and learn from you all? And then so all of this is pointing towards, how do we as an Assessment for Learning project catalyze a movement without building an empire? And so part of the strategic question is really, how do we connect with networks like INACOL and learn from and sort of plant little seeds for you all to be thinking about and sharing with one another, and sharing back with us your assessment practices that you're focusing on in your schools and your work. So there we go. Turning back to the kind of Q&A section, or kind of opening up for the conversation, I wanted to kind of turn back to this earlier question I posed for you guys, like locating yourself in our learning agenda. And I'd love to hear and have some people share really briefly if there's like questions or components of the learning agenda that's really provocative to you, or it really rings true to work you all are trying to do, and some kind of like core hypotheses, like what are you trying to understand about your work that you're doing in this area? And then I'm also open to any kind of questions too if you have kind of clarifying or other things that you'd like to learn more about Assessment for Learning project. So I'm going to kick it back, I think, to Ashley, and she can moderate this section because she's the master facilitator here. But I'm really curious, and this is an earnest conversation and an earnest invitation. We really want to engage networks like INACOL in this conversation. Like, we're catalyzing a movement, not building an empire, and we want to know how your work informs and is located and what we're trying to do as well.
Great, thank you, Sarah. We've had some really rich discussions in the chat box here about the role of assessments versus tests and shared trust, student agency, all those great things. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to chat them in the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner, or you can press the talk button on the upper left-hand corner of your screen, and you can ask your questions directly that way.
So I'll respond to Krister just asked this question, and I love this notion of find some helpful ways for all of us to learn and insights that are generated along the way. Tweets are too small and papers take too long. That's the truth. So one of the things that we're doing is, for our grantees, in lieu of traditional grant reporting mechanisms of you complete your interim and then you complete your final report, which is essentially a compliance exercise, let's be real. We've done away with those, and instead, each of our grantees has a learning plan where they identify what are your core questions, what are your core hypotheses, what evidence are you going to bring and reflect on to answer and reflect on those questions along the way, and then what are your milestones. And then identifying those milestones for self-reflection, our grantees are each going to do presentations of learning that look differently for each and every one of them, and where they're going to present to the ALP learning community, to their local community, if it's in their local context, if it's relevant, or broadcast to a broader audience through like blog posts or so forth. We as an initiative are trying to model that as well, where we've identified our key project milestones as an initiative, and we're doing presentations of learning through milestone reports. And so one of the things that we could do is make public and connect you all with the artifacts and assets that come out of both of our grantees' presentations of learning along the way, and then also our initiative-wide milestone reports. And there's actually a link earlier in the slide deck, bit.ly/ALP milestone, where you can see our first milestone, which is really a formative document. It's not a glossy white paper by any means.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And then Stan Frieda had a question. He was mentioning that one of his many tasks is to coordinate his New Hampshire e-learning for educators program, which is their online PD program. So building educator capacity in terms of PD for digital learning and teaching is of interest to him, among others. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that in terms of the work that you all are doing. Sarah, I think you might be on mute.
Oh, I am on mute. Apologies. Could you restate that question one more time?
Sure. So Stan is basically interested in building educator capacity in terms of professional development for digital learning and teaching.
Oh, wow.
So if you can talk a little bit more about building educator capacity in that regard.
No, that's really interesting. And I think that's a kind of a broader kind of question for our whole learning agenda, is to be attentive to new learning environments and new delivery systems, right? And so what are the kind of common kernels that translate across learning environments? Like, I think the need for trusting a relationship in order to make feedback meaningful, for example, in the Henry County example. That translates across different contexts, but it looks differently in the practices that we have to pursue when we're working virtually. And so I would really be interested in kind of learning more about what he's doing and what his approaches are. I think there's stuff to be learned related to the micro-credentials because it can be portable and can be translated across contexts, but we don't have any virtual schools as part of our project currently. So that's an interesting kind of component to be raised.
Great, thank you. And Stan also asked if you were looking at PD criteria that would be critical for teacher development. Is that something you guys are researching?
Yeah, so we have a small, one of our kind of communities of practice, or our small sort of collaborative learning groups, is specifically related to the questions of how we build educator capacity. And one of our goals out of that learning group isn't just to support one another to refine and kind of improve the individual grantees' work. The artifact that comes out of that learning community, we're really looking to kind of issue a set of principles, design principles for adult learning as it relates to assessment practice. And so I don't know if that would be a PD criteria, but more a set of design principles that could be applied, or almost like a self-diagnostic of, as you're designing your professional learning opportunities, like to ask yourself, are these principles evident in that work? And so our goal is definitely to issue some work related to that, but again, the initiative is very nascent, and all the grants are really just starting in earnest this summer.
Excellent, thanks. And we had a question come in from Gary, and he said in September they're going to begin a sort of moral audit about their approach to equity. So the assumption is that innovative practices lead to equity is an axiom. So what other practices or mindsets or structures should we be looking at that explicitly approach equity?
Well, I mean, that's essentially our learning agenda question, like, and a much more complex component. And I can't give you any resources today, but I love this notion of a moral audit. We're working as an initiative. We've called on some technical assistance to help us kind of unpack and explore this question of equity as it relates to kind of defining equity, drawing a lot on the National Equity Project's definition, but defining equity and the difference between equity and diversity and inclusion and the role of all three of those components in assessment, and looking at work like related to like reality pedagogy and culturally relevant practice, instructional practice. But that's an excellent question, and I don't really have an answer for it, but that's what we're looking to explore. I see one from Teresa.
Great, thank you, and I think we have time for...
Okay.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, I think we have time for one more question there from Teresa.
Is anyone adopting a practice where students select when they are ready for assessment, student increases ownership assessment, and how is that managed? So that Virginia project, Teresa, that you asked about earlier, so the Virginia student-led assessment work, it's led by Fairfax County Schools. They've been doing student-led assessment for quite a bit. The contact person there is Shannon King, but I believe that's one of the kind of like central tenets of the student-led assessment process is that it's not just students choosing the the task and the mode and the modality of their evidence of learning. It's them identifying along their own learning path when they're ready to show evidence of that, to share that evidence. And so we'd be happy to connect you with Shannon and that project, and they're working with P21 as well as sort of a network improvement science, a network improvement community. So there's a lot of interesting work happening across districts there, but we'd be happy to connect that with you.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we are just about out of time, so I would like to extend a sincere thank you to all of you for attending this wonderful webinar today, and a huge thank you to both Sarah and Linda, as well as to Gary and Jay for jumping in as well, and for sharing your great work. As I mentioned earlier, today's webinar will be recorded and archived on the inacl.org website, and we will send you all a follow-up email with that link so you can refer back to this at any time. And with that, we can stick around for a few more minutes if anyone else has any more questions. Otherwise, thank you for attending, and we'll see you at a future INACOL webinar.